The Riven
The
Protocol was
crystals
less a
resonate
peace
with our
treaty
hearts.
and more a cage built
The
for two
crystals
species.
resonate with our hearts.
It had been signed 10 years ago in the vacuum of neutral space, ending a war that had turned 3-star systems into graveyards. The document was thousands of pages long, filled with subclauses on trade tariffs, navigation rights, and orbital demilitarization zones. But there was only one clause that truly mattered, the one that every child on Earth and every hatchling on Zava learned by heart. Protocol 19. Protocol 19 prohibited physical intimacy between human and Zavine citizens. Not just marriage, not just reproduction. Any touch that crossed the line from professional to personal was classified as biological warfare. The penalty was execution. No trial, no appeal, just a cold vacuum death for those who dared to feel. The Zavine were not just another bipedal species from the Cygnus arm. They were resonant beings capable of a neurochemical exchange known as the bond kiss. To a Zavine, it was a way to share history and intent, to communicate in a language deeper than words. To the terrified human high command, it was a biological weapon that could override free will and rewrite loyalty. The propaganda machines called it subversion. The laws called it treason. Carter Brennan called it the reason his hands were sweating. He stood in the immaculate white-paneled docking bay of Aurora Station, the diplomatic outpost that served as the silent checkpoint between two civilizations that had barely stopped killing each other. The station floated in Earth orbit, positioned so that on a clear cycle you could see the green farmlands of Ohio spreading out below like a patchwork quilt. Carter had grown up down there in Dayton, in a house that smelled like cut grass and his mother's burnt toast. That house was gone now, sold after Emma died. Carter adjusted the cuffs of his dress uniform and tried to ignore the cold knot forming at the base of his spine. Every surface in this bay was polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the harsh white starlight that filtered through the reinforced viewports. Every corridor was monitored by hovering security drones that buzzed like angry wasps. Every handshake, Carter knew, had a legal team attached to it to ensure no laws were broken, no protocols violated, no feelings accidentally shared. He hated this place. It smelled of recycled air and fear. "You're doing this for her," he reminded himself, closing his eyes for just a second. The image came immediately. Emma, 27 years old, standing in their childhood kitchen in her flight suit, grinning that crooked, confident grin while she burned another batch of toast. She'd been a pilot in the 3rd Fleet, one of the best. Her F-35 had been vaporized in a skirmish over the Kestrel's Reach, just 2 days before the ceasefire was signed. 2 days. Carter had been 22 then, fresh out of the academy, still believing that following orders would somehow make sense of the universe. He'd received her last transmission at 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning in March 2017-66. "Carter, tell Mom static, just static." And then the flash of light on his monitor as her ship became atoms. The war had ended 48 hours later. The Riven Protocol was signed within a week, while Carter was still numbly packing up Emma's belongings from her quarters. He'd kept one thing, a coffee mug. White ceramic with a chipped rim, the one she'd used every morning, the one that had survived 100 carrier landings, but couldn't survive being dropped in a sink. He still had it, in his locker, wrapped in a maintenance cloth, like some kind of religious relic. Carter opened his eyes. Year 2186. Day 3652 of the Riven Protocol. He was 32 now, a liaison officer. His job was to make sure that diplomats from both sides could stand in the same room without starting another war. It was boring work, soul-crushing work, but it was necessary work because the alternative was extinction. If keeping the peace meant following draconian rules about who you could touch, then Carter would follow them. He would be the perfect cold instrument of bureaucracy. A soft chime echoed through his earpiece, followed by a voice that sounded like a philosophy professor who'd spent too much time alone. "Liaison Brennan," the AI said pleasantly, "your cortisol levels suggest either existential dread or consumption of cafeteria meatloaf. Statistically, both are plausible." Carter touched his ear. "Nexus, status report. Are we on schedule?" "Affirmative. Incoming vessel detected. Zavine diplomatic envoy arriving in approximately 90 seconds. Docking clamps are engaging as we speak. Also, your heart rate has increased by 6 beats per minute in the last 30 seconds, which suggests either anticipation or early-stage cardiac arrest. I'm betting on anticipation, but I've been wrong before. Once, in 2181, it was very traumatic. Carter almost smiled. Nexus had been his assigned AI companion for 3 years now, and the damn thing had developed what could only be described as a personality. Technically a violation of programming standards, but Carter had never reported it. Nexus was the closest thing he had to a friend up here. Just keep the security protocols active, Carter said, and maybe dial back the existential commentary. Noted, though I should mention that suppressing existential commentary is itself a form of existential commentary. I'm very deep, Carter, very deep. The docking bay speakers crackled to life, drowning out whatever Nexus was about to say next. Incoming vessel, Zavine diplomatic envoy, docking clamps engaged, decompression sequence initiated. The airlock at the far end of the bay hissed. The heavy blast doors, each one thick enough to survive a direct missile strike, groaned and began to slide apart. A mist of cryovapor rolled out across the deck, swirling and pooling around Carter's boots, like something from a ghost story. And through the fog they came. There were 4 of them, tall and slender, moving with a fluid grace that made human movement look clumsy by comparison. They wore high-collared robes of iridescent silk that seemed to shift color as they moved, flowing from charcoal gray to deep violet to something that wasn't quite blue. Their faces were pale, smooth, with features that were almost human but not quite. The proportions were just slightly off, the eyes a little too large, the cheekbones a little too sharp. But Carter only saw one of them. She walked at the front of the group, not behind, the lead position, the alpha. Her name was Lyra Thane, and intelligence reports had described her as a moderate, a scholar of xenolinguistics, a safe choice for this kind of ceremonial role. What the intelligence reports had failed to mention was that Lyra Thane looked like she'd been carved from starlight and fury. She stepped fully onto the deck, and the air in the room seemed to change. The Zavine had bioluminescent patterns beneath their skin, faint traceries of light that flared with their heartbeat and emotions. Lyra's markings were a soft electric blue, running down her neck and disappearing beneath her collar like circuit board lightning. Her skin was pale violet, smooth as alabaster. Her eyes were large and dark, without any visible whites, reflecting the harsh station lights with an intelligence that felt predatory. Carter felt the reaction immediately. It was a physical thing, a low thrum in his chest, a sudden sharpening of his vision. This was the Zavine biological effect, the pheromones that the treaty warned about. It wasn't magic, it was evolution. Being near a Zavine tricked the human hindbrain into hyper-awareness, a leftover survival mechanism from when humanity's ancestors had needed to know exactly where the predator was at all times. His heart rate kicked up, 62 beats per minute to 78 in the span of 3 seconds. He could feel his pupils dilating, his breathing deepening. Every detail of her became impossibly sharp. The way her hair fell across her shoulder, dark as a raven's wing. The subtle shift of her weight from one foot to the other. The faint scent that reached him even across the distance. Something like ozone before a lightning strike and burned cedar. He hated that he felt it. He hated that his body betrayed his discipline just because she had walked into the room. Lyra stopped exactly 3 meters away from him. She didn't bow. The Zavine never bowed. It exposed the neck, a sign of surrender in their culture. Instead, she tilted her chin up slightly, exposing her face to the light, a gesture that said, "I see you and I am not afraid." "Liaison, Brennan," she said. Her voice did strange things to the universal translator, clipped to Carter's ear. The device chirped and wheezed for half a second before settling on a voice that sounded like cello strings played underwater, rich and resonant and impossibly smooth. Carter clasped his hands behind his back to hide the faint tremor he refused to acknowledge. "Envoy Thane," he said, keeping his voice flat and professional. "Welcome to Aurora Station. We trust your journey was uneventful." "It is never uneventful when one crosses the void to meet a former enemy," Lyra said. Her lips curved just slightly. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something else, a challenge maybe, or a test. "And yet here you stand, without armor. That is a promising start." She took a step closer. The blue light beneath her cheekbones pulsed once, A slow, rhythmic beat, like a second heartbeat. The security drone floating by Carter's left shoulder beeped loudly, its sensors flashing red. "Analysis complete," the station's central AI announced, its voice cheerful and distinct and absolutely deafening in the sudden quiet of the bay. "Diplomatic greeting detected, no hostile intent registered. However, I am noting elevated pheromone levels in the immediate area. Environmental analysis suggests envoy Thane should reduce smoldering by approximately 12% to align with standard diplomatic protocols." Carter felt heat rush up his neck. The silence that followed was thick and agonizing. Lyra blinked, and then a sound escaped her throat, a short melodic trill that the translator rendered as laughter. "Your machine has a critic's eye liaison," she said, her dark eyes dancing with something that might have been amusement. "I shall attempt to smolder less for the sake of the treaty." Carter glared at the security drone. "Mute mode, now." "Acknowledge," the station AI said primly, unmuting commentary function. "Good luck, Liaison Brennan. You're sweating." The drone fell silent. Carter cleared his throat, desperate to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "If you will follow me, envoy," he said, gesturing toward the long glass-walled corridor that led deeper into the station. "The council is waiting in the grand atrium for the ratification ceremony." He turned on his heel and started walking, acutely aware of her presence just 2 steps behind him. The corridor stretched out ahead, a tunnel of reinforced glass that offered a panoramic view of the Earth below. The planet hung in the viewport like a blue marble, serene and impossibly fragile against the black void of space. Somewhere down there, in Ohio, there was a house that used to smell like burnt toast. Carter could smell Lyra. Not the generic pheromone response that the sensors had detected, but something more specific. Something that bypassed his translator and his training and spoke directly to some older part of his brain. It wasn't quite perfume. It was sharper than that, wilder. Ozone before a thunderstorm. Burned cedar after a lightning strike. Something that made his pulse quicken and his hands clench. Every security guard they passed tightened their grip on their rifles. The tension on Aurora Station was a physical weight, something you could measure in the set of shoulders and the tightness of jaws. The peace was 10 years old, but the hatred was centuries deep, passed down through generations like a family heirloom nobody wanted but everybody kept. They walked in silence for 30 seconds. 40. The only sound was the soft whisper of Lyra's robes and the faint hum of the station's life support systems. And then she spoke, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Walls make excellent prisons, Liaison Brennan." Carter kept his eyes forward. "Walls keep the vacuum out, envoy. They keep us alive." "Do they?" She shifted slightly, and the fabric of her robe brushed against his uniform sleeve. The contact was barely there, gossamer thin, but it sent a jolt through his arm like a static shock. "Or do they just keep you from seeing what is on the other side?" The air between them hummed. Not literally, not in any way that sensors could detect. But Carter felt it anyway, a tension that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the fact that this woman was forbidden and dangerous and standing close enough that he could count the luminescent patterns on her neck. He was saved from having to answer by their arrival at the Grand Atrium. The space was enormous, a massive rotunda with a transparent dome that looked out into the starfield beyond. It had been designed to impress, to make the participants in these diplomatic ceremonies feel small and insignificant beneath the weight of the cosmos. It worked. The air in the atrium was cold, recycled to the point of sterility. Dignitaries from both Earth and Zava stood on raised platforms on opposite sides of the room, separated by a wide gulf of empty floor that nobody was allowed to cross. The human delegation stood on the left, led by Admiral Garrett Strauss. He was a gray-haired man in his 60s, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite in disappointment. He wore his dress uniform like armor, every metal polished, every ribbon perfectly aligned. Carter knew the man's record. Decorated in the First Contact War, architect of the Kestrel's Reach Offensive, the kind of officer who believed that peace was just the interval between conflicts, a time to reload and rearm. The Zavine delegation stood on the right, clustered around their high sovereign, a tall figure whose bioluminescence had been dimmed to a mournful gray. The sovereign wore robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their face was hidden behind a ceremonial veil. Between the two groups, floating in midair, was a holographic projection of the vote tally. It glowed a steady amber, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Carter guided Lara to her designated podium near the center of the Zavine platform. He stood beside her as protocol dictated, acting as her human contact, her shield, her jailer. The role was deliberately ambiguous. Admiral Strauss stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. When he spoke, his voice was amplified by the room's acoustics, bouncing off the dome and the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We gather here today to reaffirm the Riven Protocol," he began, his tone heavy with the weight of rehearsed solemnity. "To remember that walls are necessary for good neighbors, that distance is the price of peace, that some boundaries exist not to divide us, but to protect us from ourselves." Lyra leaned slightly toward Carter. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible beneath the Admiral's speech. "Walls also make excellent prisons, Liaison Brennan." Carter kept his eyes forward, his face carefully neutral. "Walls keep the vacuum out, Envoy. They keep us alive." "Do they?" She shifted again, and this time when her robe brushed his sleeve, she didn't pull away. "Or do they just keep you from seeing what is truly on the other side?" Before Carter could formulate an answer that wouldn't get him court-martialed, the lights flickered. It wasn't a simple power surge. The flicker was accompanied by a sound, a deep grinding groan that came from somewhere in the station's infrastructure. The kind of sound that metal makes when it's being twisted beyond its design parameters. And then the artificial gravity failed. For one terrifying second, the entire atrium became weightless. Dignitaries floated upward, gasping, their robes and uniforms billowing around them like the petals of some enormous flower. Papers and data pads drifted past Carter's face. Someone screamed. The sound was high and sharp and quickly cut off. Then the gravity slammed back down. Not normal gravity, twice normal, maybe more. Carter's knees buckled under the sudden crushing weight. He hit the floor hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. His vision blurred. Somewhere to his right, he heard the sharp crack of bone breaking as someone's legs couldn't take the strain. And then, cutting through the chaos like a blade, a gunshot. Sharp, loud, distinct. "Get down!" It wasn't Carter who shouted. The voice was Lyra's, and it didn't sound anything like a diplomat. Before Carter could process what was happening, before his brain could catch up to his adrenaline, hands grabbed the front of his uniform jacket. Lyra didn't move like a scholar. She moved like a striker, like someone who had trained in combat since childhood. She yanked him sideways with shocking strength, pulling him off his feet and behind the heavy marble plinth of the podium. A second shot rang out. The stone where Carter's head had been a heartbeat earlier exploded in a shower of white dust and fragments. They collapsed together in the narrow space behind the podium, pressed against the cold floor. Lyra was crouched over him, one hand on his chest to keep him down, her other hand braced against the marble. For a frozen moment, the chaos of the room faded into background noise. Carter looked up at her. Her bioluminescence was flaring wild and bright, turning her skin into a map of distress. The patterns raced across her neck and face, pulsing from blue to white to something that looked almost violet. Her hand was warm through his shirt. He could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse against his own ribcage. Or maybe it was his pulse. Or maybe there was no difference anymore. The proximity alarm on his belt should have been screaming. Touching a Zavine was a Class 1 felony under Protocol 19, punishable by immediate execution. But the alarm was silent, damaged in the fall or simply overwhelmed by the other emergencies flooding the station's networks. And Lyra wasn't attacking him. She was shielding him. Her body was between him and the direction the shots had come from. "Stay low," she hissed, her eyes scanning the room over the rim of the podium. That was a kinetic slug, high velocity. Someone is not using station-approved weapons. Carter's brain finally caught up. His training kicked in like a switch being thrown. He reached for his comms unit, fumbling it from his belt with shaking fingers. "Security, this is Liaison Brennan. We have active shooters in the Grand Atrium. Multiple casualties. I need..." The rest of his words were drowned out by the sound of the atrium descending into complete pandemonium. Screaming diplomats, shouting guards, the wet thud of bodies hitting the floor. And above it all, the wail of emergency sirens as the station's AI finally realized that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Through the confusion, Carter saw a Davine guard on the far side of the room collapse, blue blood pooling on the white floor beneath them. The guard's bioluminescence flickered once, twice, and then went dark. Total chaos. And then the giant view screen above the atrium, the one usually reserved for displaying star charts and navigation data, hijacked itself. The feed cut to a security recording, grainy and stuttering. It showed the docking bay they had just left. Lyra's personal escort craft sat in its berth, and a human security team was pulling something from its cargo hold. A massive, sleek rifle, crates of black metal canisters. The voice of the station commander boomed over the emergency speakers, cutting through the sirens and the screaming. Arrest Envoy Thane immediately. Biological weapons and unauthorized ballistics found in her transport vessel. This is a Zavine attack. Repeat, this is a Zavine attack. All personnel, Code Crimson protocols are now in effect. Carter froze. He looked at the screen, then he looked back at Lyra. She wasn't looking at the evidence. She was looking at him. Her expression wasn't fear. It wasn't shock. It was a resigned, furious sorrow, the kind of expression someone wears when they've just had their worst suspicions confirmed. I did not bring weapons, Carter, she said quietly, using his first name for the first time. The intimacy of it was jarring. They are faster than I expected. Carter's training screamed at him. The evidence was right there on the screen. The timing, the gravity failure, the assassination attempt, it all pointed to a Zavine first strike, a carefully orchestrated attack designed to look like it had happened during a peaceful ceremony. But his gut, the part of him that remembered the way she had just pulled him out of the line of fire, the part that recognized genuine surprise when he saw it, hesitated. Nexus, he subvocalized, knowing the AI could pick up his words even if nobody else could. Gravity failure. Where did the override command originate? There was a pause, half a second of processing time that felt like an eternity. Station Command Terminal, Nexus replied, its voice lacking all trace of its earlier humor. Specifically Admiral Strauss's personal console, Command Authorization Code Alpha 7 Tango. That's very concerning, Carter. The security teams in black armor were already swarming the podium. 6 of them, moving with practiced efficiency, laser sights dancing across Lyra's chest like red fireflies. Hands up! Do not move! Step away from the human! Lyra slowly raised her hands. The light under her skin dimmed to a dull, bruised purple. She looked at Carter one last time as the guards rushed in, grabbing her arms and forcing her to her knees on the cold floor. Tell them the truth, she whispered to him. Carter, still on the ground, still trying to make sense of what had just happened, stared at her. What truth? The truth is on the screen. The truth, Lyra said as they dragged her toward the exit, her voice cutting through the noise with perfect clarity, is that you are the only one here who is not already bought. And then she was gone, pulled through a side door that Carter hadn't even known existed. The atrium was in chaos. Medical teams were rushing in. The Admiral was shouting orders. Someone was crying. Carter stayed on the floor for another few seconds, his mind racing. The evidence said one thing, his gut said another. And somewhere in his earpiece, Nexus was very quietly repeating a single piece of information. Admiral Strauss's console, Carter. The gravity failure came from Admiral Strauss's console. Carter pulled himself to his feet, his knees ached. His uniform was torn. And for the first time in 10 years, since the morning Emma's ship had turned to atoms, he felt the old familiar feeling, the feeling that he was being lied to. The detention block on level 10 was a fortress within a fortress. It had been designed specifically to hold Zavine prisoners, with dampening shields to prevent their bioluminescence from being used as a signaling system, and harsh white lights calibrated to cause discomfort without crossing into the territory of torture. Lyra Thane sat on the single metal bench in her cell, hands folded in her lap, her light dim and carefully controlled. She looked up when Carter approached the observation window. You found the discrepancy, she said. It wasn't a question. Carter stood on the other side of the reinforced glass, his reflection ghostly in its surface. He was supposed to be drafting the formal declaration of treaty violation. Admiral Strauss had personally ordered him to do so, had stood in Carter's cramped office and told him in no uncertain terms that this was his duty, his purpose, the reason he wore the uniform. But Carter had spent the last hour going through security logs instead, and what he'd found didn't make any sense. Unless it did. Unless the only way it made sense was the way he didn't want it to. The gravity grid, Carter said, keeping his voice level. It was accessed from a terminal in the security hub. A Zavine couldn't have done that. You would need human authorization codes. No, Lyra agreed, but a human who wants a war could. She stood up and walked toward the glass. The energy barrier that usually separated high-risk prisoners from their visitors was down. Another malfunction or another piece of the trap. "Why are you here, Carter?" she asked softly. "I need to know who you're working with," he said, trying to maintain his interrogation stance. "If this is a false flag operation, someone on my side helped you. Give me a name." "I am not working with anyone," Lyra said. "I was the target, Carter. Don't you see?" She stopped a foot away from the glass, close enough that he could see the individual patterns in her bioluminescence, like constellations just beneath her skin. They kill a Zavine guard, they frame a Zavine envoy, and suddenly the treaty is void. The fleets mobilize. The silence ends. It's perfect, clean. Nobody has to take responsibility for restarting the war. It just happens. Carter looked at her face, searching for the lie, the manipulation, the thing that would tell him this was all an elaborate trick. He didn't find it. "They expect you to file the report," Lyra continued. "They expect you to be the good soldier who follows the rules. The man who lost his sister and hates us enough to believe the worst." "I don't hate you," Carter said. The words slipped out before he could check them, raw and unfiltered. Lyra's eyes widened slightly. For a moment, she looked almost vulnerable. "Then prove it," she said. She stepped closer to the glass. The violation of protocol was so flagrant, it made Carter's head spin. He should have backed away. Should have called for the guards. Should have done literally anything except what he did, which was stand there and stare into those dark, galaxy-deep eyes. "This is a setup," she whispered, her voice tense and urgent. "The moment you leave this room, the council will move me to a black site facility. I will disappear into a hole so deep that even your Admiral Strauss will forget I existed. And the war will start tonight. The fleets are already positioning. All they need is the final provocation." "What do you want me to do?" Carter asked, his voice barely more than a breath. "I need to get to the hangar bay. I need to reach my ship and leave the station." "That's insanity. We would be shot down before we cleared the magnetic containment field." "Not if we're together," she said. "Not if you trust me." She looked at his lips. The look was deliberate, heavy with a biological weight that hit Carter like a physical blow. And then she said it, the two words that would change everything. "Kiss me." Carter froze. Every system in his body seemed to lock up simultaneously. "What?" "Kiss me," Lyra repeated, her voice dropping to something that was almost a whisper, almost a command, almost a plea. "And break the protocol." Carter's heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. He knew what the bond kiss did. It wasn't just intimacy. It was a neural bridge, a resonance between two nervous systems. If she kissed him, if he allowed it, the station sensors would pick up the chemical cascade immediately. It would trigger every alarm in the sector. It would brand him a traitor instantly, but it would also create a chaotic biometric feedback loop in the local security grid. A momentary blindness. A window where they could move without being tracked. "I cannot," Carter said. The words felt rigid, forced out through a throat that had gone tight. "It's treason." "It is only treason if we lose," Lyra challenged. "I said no," Carter said, louder this time. He refused her, he denied her, but the air between them crackled with the truth that both of them could feel. He wanted to. The want was a physical ache in his chest, a hunger that had nothing to do with protocol, and everything to do with the fact that she was standing close enough to touch, and he had spent his entire adult life being told that this, exactly this, was the most forbidden thing in the universe. The denial hung in the air between them, heavy and unconvincing. And then the red alert klaxons began to wail. "Attention!" The automated voice screamed through every speaker in the detention block. Security breach detected in detention block. Lockdown initiated. Purge protocols active. All personnel evacuate immediately. Lyra's eyes widen. They're not waiting for a trial. They're purging the block. They're going to vent the atmosphere and kill everyone in it. Carter looked at the heavy blast door. The locking mechanism was already cycling through its sequence, heavy bolts sliding into place. Red lights strobed across the corridor outside. "If we stay here, we die," Lyra said flatly. Carter made his choice. It wasn't the kiss, it was survival. But sometimes survival and treason look exactly the same. He grabbed her arm, not romantically, but with desperate utility, and pulled her toward the back of the cell, where a service panel sat flush with the wall. "Maintenance hatch," he shouted over the sirens. "Leads to the waste disposal system." He jammed his liaison clearance key into the panel's slot. It flashed red. Denied. "Override," Carter yelled at his earpiece. "Nexus, are you listening?" "Always listening, Carter," the AI's voice came through, sounding oddly calm amidst the screaming alarms. "Though I must note that your heart rate is currently consistent with someone running a marathon or falling in love. Perhaps both. Open the hatch, Nexus." "Accessing, one moment. I'm bypassing 3 layers of federal encryption. Please do not tell the IT department about this. They get very upset when I commit felonies." The panel hissed and popped open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft filled with cables and recycled air that smelled like burnt plastic and old food. "Go!" Carter shoved Lyra toward the opening. She scrambled into the darkness without hesitation, moving with that same fluid grace she'd shown in the docking bay. Carter dove in after her just as the cell door behind them blew open. Laser fire scorched the wall where they had been standing half a second ago, superheating the metal until it glowed cherry red. They crawled through the cramped maintenance veins of the station, the metal scraping against Carter's knees, tearing his uniform. It was hot in the shaft, dark, and smelled of burning circuitry. Behind them, he could hear the security teams trying to follow, shouting coordinates and authorization codes. "Left at the junction," Carter directed, his voice tight. "That leads to the zero-gravity waste disposal chutes." They reached the junction and tumbled out into a vertical shaft. The gravity here was null, disabled for the waste processing systems. They floated, weightless, surrounded by drifting debris and the occasional piece of refuse that hadn't been properly incinerated. Lyra kicked off the wall, spinning with elegant grace in the zero-G, and grabbed Carter's hand to stabilize him. Her fingers were cool against his skin. He could feel her pulse through the contact, rapid and strong. "We need a ship," she said. "My clearance is revoked," Carter replied, checking his wrist computer. The screen was flashing red. Trader status confirmed. "Kill on site authorization active. They're tracking us." He showed her the display. The security teams weren't searching randomly. They were converging on the waste chute with surgical precision. They knew exactly where Carter and Lyra were at every moment. "How?" Lyra asked. Carter tapped his earpiece. "Nexus. Who is feeding them our location?" "Command Center," Nexus replied, its voice carrying none of its usual whimsy. "Specifically Terminal Alpha 1. That's Admiral Strauss's personal console." Carter felt a cold certainty wash over him. It wasn't just a rogue agent. It wasn't just a conspiracy. It was Strauss. The man who had signed the treaty was the same man trying to burn it down. The architect of peace was the enemy. "We can't go to the main hangar," Carter said. "They'll be waiting." Lyra looked down the long, dark shaft, her bioluminescence providing the only light. "There's a diplomatic skiff docked at the auxiliary port. Small, fast, lightly guarded. It's also locked down." Lyra smiled, and her bioluminescence flared a bright, defiant blue. "I'm excellent at unlocking things." They pushed off the walls, diving down the zero-G shaft like falling stars. The station's infrastructure was a maze of ducts and passages, and Carter had spent 3 years learning every inch of it. They navigated by feel and memory, dodging cleaning drones and filtration meshes, always staying one step ahead of the security teams that were closing in. They burst out of the waste chute into the auxiliary bay. The skiff sat on its landing pad, a sleek silver needle of a ship, its hull still gleaming despite the harsh dock lights. 2 guards stood by the access ramp, rifles held ready but not quite aimed. They looked bored. Nobody expected an attack from inside the station. Lyra didn't hesitate. She used the residual momentum from the zero-G shaft to slam into the first guard, a blur of speed and precision. The impact was brutal and efficient, a strike to the neck that dropped the guard instantly, unconscious before they hit the deck. The second guard raised their rifle. Carter didn't think. He tackled the guard, driving his shoulder into their gut. They hit the deck together, the rifle skittering away across the metal floor. "Get inside!" Carter shouted, scrambling to his feet. Lyra was already at the skiff's airlock. She punched the keypad and it flashed red, denied. Without missing a beat, she placed her palm flat against the panel. Her bioluminescence flared, pouring into the security system like liquid electricity. The lock turned green. The ramp hissed down just as the heavy bay doors at the far end began to open. A full squad of armored troopers poured in, weapons already firing. Blue plasma bolts sizzled through the air around them, superheating the atmosphere into visible shockwaves. One bolt struck the hull near Carter's head, showering him with sparks and molten metal. He felt the heat on his face, smelled his own hair singeing. They threw themselves into the cockpit. Lyra slid into the pilot's seat, her hands flying over the controls with practiced precision. Carter dropped into the co-pilot position, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. "Strap in," Lyra said. "Can you fly a human ship?" "Math is universal, Carter." The engines roared to life with a high-pitched scream. The docking clamps were still engaged, massive magnetic locks designed to hold a ship in place through anything short of a direct missile strike. "Disengage clamps!" Carter shouted. "No time!" Lyra gritted her teeth. She slammed the throttle forward. The skiff lurched. Metal shrieked against metal, a sound like the universe tearing itself apart. With a violent shudder, the ship ripped itself free from the magnetic locks, shearing off part of the landing gear in the process. Alarm screamed. The viewport filled with warning lights. They shot out of the bay, spinning wildly into the void. Behind them, Aurora Station grew smaller, a glittering diamond against the black canvas of space. But as Carter looked back, he saw the flashes. Point defense cannons were tracking them, their turrets swiveling with mechanical precision. "Hold on," Lyra said. She banked the ship hard, pulling G-forces that made Carter's vision blur at the edges. The stars wheeled around them in a dizzying spiral. Plasma fire stitched through the space where they had been a heartbeat before. The skiff danced through the incoming barrage, Lyra's hands steady on the controls. She dove toward the local jump gate, the massive ring structure that would allow them to enter faster than light transit. "We're leaving," Carter said, staring at the shrinking station where he had spent the last 3 years of his life. "We just kidnapped an envoy and stole a diplomatic vessel. We started a war." "No," Lyra said, her eyes fixed on the stars ahead, her voice absolutely certain. "The war started 10 minutes ago. We're just the only ones who know how to end it." She punched in coordinates that Carter didn't recognize. The jump gate activated, its ring glowing with barely contained energy. The stars began to elongate into streaks of light, and for the first time in 10 years, since the morning he'd received Emma's last transmission, Carter Brennan was truly off the grid. He was sitting next to a woman he was forbidden to want, racing into the dark unknown, with half the galaxy about to hunt them down. He should have been terrified. Instead, as they punched through into jump space and reality turned inside out around them, he felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. He felt alive. The stolen diplomatic skiff was a sleek needle of silver threading through the velvet dark of the void, but it was currently screaming. Not metaphorically. The ship's hull was vibrating at a frequency that made Carter's teeth ache, and every control panel was flashing angry red warnings like a Christmas tree designed by someone who hated joy. Carter fought with the navigation controls, his knuckles white against the leather grip of the yoke. The dashboard, which had been a comforting array of green status lights only an hour ago, now looked like a medical monitor attached to a dying patient. "We're losing navigation," Carter shouted over the whine of the engines. Lyra sat in the co-pilot seat, her bioluminescence pulsing in rapid staccato bursts that turned her face into a strobing mask of concentration. She didn't look panicked. She looked like a scientist observing an interesting, if potentially fatal, chemical reaction. "It's not a malfunction," she said, her fingers flying across the holographic interface that hovered above her lap. "It's a lockout. Someone with command codes is stripping our permissions remotely. Let me guess, Admiral Strauss. They're shutting down the life support first, then the stabilizers, then the engine core, in that order. Very methodical. There was something almost admiring in her tone. Carter cursed under his breath. Command codes meant the people who had signed his paychecks for 10 years were now actively trying to suffocate him in the middle of nowhere. "Can you override it?" he asked. "I'm rewriting the control logic as we speak," Lyra said, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "But human code is incredibly stubborn. It's built like a brick wall, all rigid pathways and redundant fail-safes. Zavine code is like water, flowing around obstacles." "We'll be water faster," Carter snapped. The oxygen scrubbers just went offline. The air in the small cabin was already growing stale. The sharp tang of recycled ozone that Carter had grown used to was fading, replaced by the heaviness of carbon dioxide. His head was beginning to ache. The artificial gravity flickered, making Carter's stomach lurch into his throat before slamming back down. He gripped the armrests of his seat and tried not to vomit. "Analysis," Nexus chimed in, its voice unhelpfully calm. "Cabin pressure dropping at 0.03 atmospheres per minute. Hull temperature decreasing. Current trajectory suggests you have approximately 12 minutes until asphyxiation becomes the primary concern. 14 minutes until you freeze to death. On the bright side, your corpses will be perfectly preserved for future archaeologists to study." "Not helping, Nexus," Carter gritted out. "Warning," Nexus continued, completely ignoring him. "Elevated respiration detected in liaison Brennan. Heart rate 120 beats per minute. I recommend controlled breathing exercises. Alternatively, I have a database of 3,000 limericks about impending doom. Would you like to hear one? There once was a pilot named Carter, whose ship became his funeral altar." "Mute," Carter ordered. Lyra made a sharp, fluid motion with her hand, as if she were catching an invisible fly in midair. The holographic interface flared bright blue. "Got it," she said. The red warning lights blinked once and turned a steady amber. Isolated the command receiver. "They can't isolate the command receiver. They can't lock us out again unless they physically board the ship. But we're running on bypass protocols now. The navigation is blind. We're drifting." Carter slumped in his seat, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical wave. His hands were shaking. He looked over at Lyra. Her bioluminescence was pulsing slowly now, fading in and out with her breathing. In the dim emergency lighting of the cockpit, she looked less like a diplomat and more like something elemental. A creature made of starlight and secrets. He thought about the cell. He thought about the way she had looked at him when she'd said those two impossible words. "Kiss me." "Why did you say it?" Carter asked quietly. Lyra turned her head. The movement was slow, deliberate. "Say what, Carter?" "Kiss me and break the protocol." He quoted her own words back at her. "You know what the Bond kiss is. You know it's treason. You know the propaganda. They say it's biological sabotage, that it rewrites the human brain to serve Zavine interests. Is that what you believe?" she asked. Carter was quiet for a moment. "I believe the law exists for a reason." Lyra unbuckled her crash harness and turned her seat to face him fully. "The Bond kiss is not sabotage, Carter. It's resonance." She tapped her temple with a long violet finger. "Zavine are not telepathic in the way your fiction writers imagine. We don't read thoughts like words on a page. We share the architecture of experience. When two Zavine bond, they synchronize neural patterns. For a moment, there is no lie. There is no hiding. If I'm in pain, you feel the exact weight of it pressing on your chest. If I remember the smell of rain on my homeworld, you smell it too, as if you were standing there with me." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "It's beautiful, and it's dangerous, because it destroys the ability to hate. It's very hard to kill someone when you can feel their fear as if it were your own. That's why your government banned it. Not because it enslaves you, but because it liberates you from their narrative." Carter stared at her. The explanation made a terrifying amount of sense. A weapon of empathy, a biological treaty that bypassed politicians and propaganda and went straight to the truth of what another person felt. "Then why offer it to me?" Carter challenged, his voice rising slightly. "If it's that powerful, if it connects us that deeply, why tempt me with it in a prison cell? You barely know me. I'm just a handler, a bureaucrat." Lyra's expression softened, but her gaze remained piercing. "I needed to know." "Know what?" I needed to know if you were ruled by fear or by choice. She tilted her head. A man who obeys the law because he's afraid of punishment is useless to me. A man who obeys the law because he believes it's right is dangerous. But a man who wants to break the law and chooses not to because he has discipline? A faint smile touched her lips. That's a man who can be trusted. Carter felt a flush of something between anger and relief. You were testing me. I was reading you, Lyra corrected, and you passed. You wanted to do it. I felt the spike in your pulse through the floor vibrations. I smelled the change in your pheromone signature. But you said no. She smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't a diplomatic mask. It was genuine, slightly wicked. Though for the record, your denial was not very convincing. Carter looked away, staring out at the starfield beyond the viewport. The worst part was that she was right. He was still thinking about it. Even now, with a death sentence on his head and half a galaxy of enemies hunting them, the memory of her proximity in that cell was louder than the alarms. We need supplies, Carter said, changing the subject with desperate abruptness. This skiff has fuel for maybe 2 days. We have no food, no weapons, and a transponder that's broadcasting our location to anyone with a basic scanner. Lyra accepted the change of topic with a graceful nod. There is a place, the Drift of Solace. Never heard of it. It's a salvage bazaar built into the skeletal ribs of a dead battlecruiser from the First Contact War. It drifts in the magnetic shadow of the Terminus Belt, where sensors don't work properly. No official oversight, no laws, and most importantly, no questions. Sounds like the kind of place where we'd get our throats cut for our boots. Probably, Lyra agreed. But the alternative is suffocating in this cockpit while Admiral Strauss drinks his morning coffee. I know which I prefer. She pulled up the navigation charts, her fingers dancing through the holographic projections. It's a 2-hour jump from here. If we go there, we're leaving the known charts. No communications buoys, no rescue if something goes wrong. Carter looked at the coordinates she was indicating. They were far off the standard trade routes, deep in the kind of space that didn't appear on official maps. Set the course. Let's see what we can find in the shadows. The Drift of Solace looked like a metallic carcass picked clean by vultures, then inhabited by the vultures. It was a monstrosity of welded debris, a patchwork nightmare that had grown organically over decades. The spine of the station was the shattered hull of a Montana-class heavy cruiser, its ribs flayed open to the vacuum like the remains of some great beast. Inside the rib cage, a chaotic city had metastasized. Modules and cargo containers and stolen engine cells welded together in a gravity-defying lattice, all of it illuminated by flickering neon signs in pink and green and sulfur yellow. Carter guided the skiff into a docking clam that looked like it hadn't been serviced since the war that had killed the cruiser. The magnetic locks engaged with a grinding thud that made the entire ship shudder. Put this on, Carter said, tossing a heavy mechanic's coat he'd found in the emergency locker to Lyra. The fabric was stained with oil and smelled like burnt rubber. It will not hide my face, Lyra noted, pulling the greasy fabric over her iridescent robes. Or my skin. Or the fact that I'm clearly not from around here. Carter reached into the back of the locker and pulled out a small, disc-shaped device. Spectrum cloak, standard issue for covert operations. Though this one looks like it's been through a trash compactor. He clipped it to her collar. It creates a photonic distortion field around your face. To anyone looking directly at you, your features will blur. You'll look like a generic humanoid shape. It's not perfect, but it beats being recognized as the most wanted fugitive in the sector. Lyra activated the device. Her face rippled and blurred like a reflection in a disturbed pond. It itches, she complained, her voice taking on a slightly synthesized quality. Just don't make any sudden moves, Carter warned, and try not to laugh. Why would I laugh? The emotional resonance of a Zavian laugh disrupts the photon emitter. The cloak glitches, shows your real face. Lyra made a sound that was definitely a suppressed giggle. The cloak flickered wildly, revealing her glowing blue cheekbones for a split second before blurring again. Noted, she said. I shall be the soul of sobriety. They stepped out of the airlock and into the drift. The smell hit Carter first. It was a mixture of frying oil, unwashed bodies, hydraulic fluid, and something else he couldn't quite identify, but which reminded him of burnt copper. The main concourse was a narrow metal gangway suspended over a drop that went down for what looked like hundreds of meters into the dark belly of the dead ship. Crowds pushed past them, humans with cybernetic limbs that sparked, Zavine outcasts with their bioluminescence dimmed to gray. Other species Carter didn't recognize, hulking forms in environment suits and small, scurrying creatures in breathing masks. "Keep your head down," Carter murmured. "We're looking for a broker named Kellen. He deals in information and lost things." They navigated the labyrinth of scrap lanes. Stalls lined the walls, selling everything from repurposed reactor cores to bootleg sensory simulations. A vendor shouted at Carter, holding up a jar of what looked like pickled protein grubs. Carter ignored him. He felt Lyra's hand brush his arm. She was moving with a tense, coiled energy, her head swiveling to track threats he couldn't see. Even with the spectrum cloak distorting her features, there was something about the way she moved that drew attention. Predatory grace, the kind of movement that came from a lifetime of combat training. They found Kellen's shop at the end of a dead-end corridor, lit by a single buzzing red light. The sign above the door said archives and spare parts in 3 different languages, 2 of which Carter couldn't read. The interior was a cave of digital detritus. Stacks of memory cores, ancient hard drives, and crystalline data shards formed unstable towers that reached toward the ceiling. Behind a counter made of welded engine plating sat Kellen. He was human, mostly. Half of his face had been replaced by a sensory lattice of chrome and red lenses that whirred and clicked as they focused on Carter and Lyra. His left arm was a mechanical claw that twitched rhythmically as he sorted through a pile of microchips. "You look like trouble," Kellen rasped, his voice grinding like gravel in a blender. "And you smell like government." Carter placed a credit chip on the counter. It was his entire savings, 8,000 credits drained from his account 5 minutes before the freeze order had hit. "We're paying customers." Kellen's mechanical eye whirred, zooming in on the chip. He snatched it up with his claw. "Generous. What do you want?" "Information," Carter said. "We're looking for the source of a signal, a specific frequency used during the Aurora incident." Kellen froze. The mechanical claw stopped twitching. "You mean the assassination attempt? The one that has the whole galaxy holding its breath before the screaming starts?" "We need to know who's profiting from it," Lyra said, her distorted voice still carrying an unmistakable authority. Kellen looked at her, his red lenses narrowed. "Nice trick with the light, lady. But you can't mask pheromones. You're Zavine, high caste by the smell of it." "The information," Lyra said flatly. "Now." Kellen leaned back in his chair. "There are rumors, whispers in the static, 2 groups making a lot of noise on the darknet, the Cinder Pact and the Ivory Ascendancy." Carter frowned. "I know the Cinder Pact, human extremists, ex-military hardliners who think the treaty was a surrender. But the Ivory Ascendancy, Savine purists," Lyra said, her voice going cold. "They believe humanity is a biological contaminant. They want to seal the jump gates and isolate our systems forever." "Bingo," Kellen said. "They hate each other, but they hate peace more. Rumor is they've formed a coalition of convenience, a partnership to burn the house down so they can fight over the ashes." "Do you have proof?" Carter asked. Kellen rummaged under the counter and pulled out a jagged, blackened shard of crystal. "This came off a smuggler's skiff this morning. It's a corrupted security log from the Aurora incident. Shows the timing of the assassination shots." He shoved the shard into a reader mounted on his desk. A holographic display flickered to life, grainy and unstable. It showed tactical data, weapons telemetry, firing solutions. And there, in the corner of the display, a timestamp. The command to fire had been sent 3 seconds before the trigger was pulled. "It's not a local reaction," Carter realized, staring at the numbers. "It's a remote execution. Someone sent the order before the shots were fired." "Exactly," Kellen said. "And the signal origin isn't Aurora Station. It's not Earth. It's not Java either." "Where is it?" Lara asked, leaning forward. Kellen tapped a set of coordinates that made absolutely no sense. They were spatial markers for an area that shouldn't exist on any standard chart. "Sector 0, he said. "The relic zone." Carter felt a chill run down his spine. The relic zone was unmapped space, a region of the galaxy littered with the debris of a civilization that had died 1 million years before humans, or Zavine, had learned to make fire. It was forbidden territory, quarantined, the kind of place that appeared in classified reports with words like unpredictable and hazardous, and do not approach under any circumstances. That's impossible, Carter said. Nobody goes to Sector Zero. Well, somebody did, Kellen replied. And they fired the shot that's about to restart your war. Before Carter could ask anything else, Nexus spoke up in his earpiece. Interruption, the AI said pleasantly. I detect 4 individuals approaching from the corridor behind you. Heart rates consistent with aggression. Also, they're carrying thermal disruptors, which seems excessive for a casual shopping trip. Bounty hunters, Carter hissed. Kellen swore and slammed his claw down on a button under the counter. A heavy blast shield dropped over the shop front with a crash, plunging them into near darkness. Out the back, Kellen shouted, pointing his claw toward a narrow hatch in the floor. Go, I don't get paid enough to die for tourists. Carter grabbed Lyra's hand and they dropped through the hatch, landing on a catwalk 3 levels down. Behind them, the sound of the shop front exploding inward echoed through the station's metal bones. Above them, heavy boots clattered on metal. There, the voice shouted. The woman! It's the Zavine envoy! Laser fire rained down from above, sizzling against the metal grating. Sparks flew. Run, Lyra yelled. They sprinted along the catwalk, the entire bazaar waking up to the violence around them. Civilians screamed and scattered. The bounty hunters were fast, using jump packs to leap between levels like mechanical grasshoppers. We're cut off, Carter shouted, skidding to a halt. Ahead of them, the walkway simply ended. There was nothing beyond it but a 100-meter drop into the gravity well of the ship's recycling core. Behind them, the hunters were closing in, their weapons humming with barely contained energy. Lyra pointed to a massive glowing tube running parallel to the drop. The gravity shear tunnel. It's a cargo transport system. Gravity is manipulated to shoot containers at high speeds through the station. Carter looked at her like she was insane. That will crush us. Not if we ride the wake, Lyra said. She grabbed his hand, her grip strong and certain. Trust me, Carter. She didn't wait for an answer. She pulled him over the railing. They fell. For one terrifying second, Carter felt weightless, suspended in the air like a puppet with cut strings. And then the artificial gravity of the sheer tunnel caught them. It didn't crush them. It grabbed them like a giant invisible hand and threw them forward. The world became a blur of blue lights and rushing wind. They were sliding down the magnetic rails faster than a free fall, their bodies horizontal in the airstream, the tunnel walls streaking past in bands of color. Lyra laughed. It was a pure, terrified, exhilarating sound that cut through the roar of the tunnel. Her spectrum cloak glitched wildly, flashing her true face in stroboscopic bursts. Her eyes were bright with adrenaline and something that looked like joy. They shot out the other end of the tube and tumbled onto a heap of soft insulation foam in a cargo bay. Carter lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs that felt like it might crack bone. Lyra rolled over next to him, her hair a mess, her spectrum cloak shorting out with sparks and dying squeals. That, Carter wheezed, was not in the manual. No, Lyra agreed, grinning despite the fact that they just nearly died. But it was effective. They found refuge in what had once been the ship's chapel. It was an abandoned section of the cruiser, a vast dome chamber that had served as a place of worship for the crew back when the ship had been alive. Now it was a tomb. The air was cold and perfectly still. Floating in the zero-gravity field near the ceiling were hundreds of small golden discs, memorial chits for the soldiers who had died when the ship was destroyed. They drifted like dust motes in the pale artificial starlight that filtered through cracked viewports. It was quiet here. The noise of the bazaar was a distant hum, muffled by layers of dead metal and vacuum. Carter sat on a pew that had been bolted to the floor, checking his weapon. A stun-pulse pistol he'd lifted from the skiff's emergency kit. His hands were shaking, not much, but enough to notice. Lyra stood by one of the viewports, staring out at the debris field that surrounded the drift. She deactivated her malfunctioning spectrum cloak. Her skin glowed softly in the darkness, the bioluminescent patterns tracing the line of her spine and shoulders like a river of stars. You're afraid, she said without turning around. I'm being hunted by half the galaxy, Carter replied, but fear is a rational response. Not that fear. She turned to face him. You're afraid of yourself. Carter lowered the pistol. He looked at her, standing there in the dim light, beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Alien, yes, but undeniably, devastatingly present. In the cell, Carter said, his voice rough. When you asked me to kiss you, I didn't say no because of the protocol. Lyra walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the metal floor. Why did you say no? Because I knew that if I started, I wouldn't be able to stop. The confession came out raw, unfiltered. I've spent my whole life building walls, rules, protocols, the treaty. It's all structure. It keeps the chaos out. He looked up at her. You are Case. You're everything I'm supposed to guard against, and when you're close to me, the walls don't just crack. They dissolve, and that terrifies me more than the war. Lyra stopped right in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. She reached out and touched his face. Her fingers were cool and smooth. A jolt of electricity went through him, sharper than the stun pistol's charge. Chaos is just another word for change, Carter, she whispered. Don't mistake control for strength. It takes more strength to feel than it does to build a wall. She leaned in, her face inches from his. Her eyes were dark, infinite pools that seemed to contain entire galaxies. I prefer you dangerous, Carter. I prefer you when you're not hiding behind a rulebook. She didn't kiss him. She pulled back, leaving his skin burning where she had touched him. It was a tease, yes, but it was also a dare, a challenge to exist in that uncomfortable space between desire and duty. Carter let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. You're enjoying this immensely, he said. It's rare to see a human struggle with something as simple as want, she admitted, her eyes sparkling with mischief. She turned back to the data pad she'd connected to the shard Kellen had given them, the moment shifting from intimate to professional with jarring speed. We have the coordinates, she said, the signal origin. Sector 0, the relic zone. Carter stood, forcing his mind back to the mission. It's a 2-hour jump from here. If we go there, we're leaving the known charts completely, Lyra said. No communications buoys, no rescue, no backup. Just us and whatever's waiting in that forbidden space. If the signal came from there, Carter said, buttoning his jacket, then the answers are there. And if the Cinder Pact and the Ivory Ascendancy are working together, they're hiding something big. We go then? Lyra asked. Carter looked at her. At this woman who had saved his life, who challenged him, who made him want things he'd spent a decade trying not to feel. We go. The skiff dropped out of warp at the edge of the relic zone, and Carter's first thought was that they'd made a terrible mistake. Space here wasn't black. It was a bruised purple, swirling with clouds of ionized warmth that moved in patterns that defied physics. Hanging in the void were structures, not ships, not asteroids. Geometric shapes of impossible size, pyramids and spheres, and crystalline rings the size of moons, made of some material that refracted the distant starlight into rainbows. They floated in a silent dead ballet untouched by time. But the most disturbing thing was the space itself. It seemed to fold. Stars in the background appeared to stretch and snap back like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Impossible geometry detected, Nexus announced. Warning. Euclidean physics are currently optional in this sector. I recommend keeping all hands and feet inside the vehicle at all times. Also, try not to think about how fundamentally this violates everything you were taught in school. It's very upsetting. Carter steered the skiff toward the largest structure, a shattered ring that pulsed with a faint rhythmic heartbeat of light. That's where the signal came from, Lyra said, pointing. Carter pushed the throttle forward. The skiff glided past the perimeter markers that warned ships to stay away. The sensors screamed as reality bent around them. The stars twisted into spirals. As they crossed the threshold into the zone, Carter felt a strange pressure building in his head. Not pain exactly, more like a hum that wasn't sound but sensation, like memories trying to surface from deep water. Do you feel that? He asked. Lyra nodded, her eyes wide. It feels like memory. The skiff touched down on the shattered moon of Iona with a vibration that rattled Carter's teeth and made the hull groan like a wounded animal. This place was not a world in any standard sense. It was a graveyard of physics, a wound in the fabric of space that had never properly healed. The moon had been cracked open eons ago by a force that defied calculation, leaving a jagged crescent of rock floating in a soup of violet nebula gas. But it was what clung to the rock that made Carter's breath catch in his throat. Crystalline ruins grew out of the cratered surface like jagged glass forests. They pulsed with a rhythm that felt disturbingly organic, syncing with the hum of the ship's dying engines. Each structure was translucent, refracting the strange purple light of the nebula into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Carter unbuckled his harness, his movements stiff. The sensor display on the dashboard was spinning wildly, unable to lock onto a stable horizon line. North and south meant nothing here. Atmosphere is breathable, Nexus announced, though the AI's voice carried a digital tremor of uncertainty. However, temporal variance is fluctuating. Local space-time appears to be malleable. I strongly recommend you do not think about your childhood, your regrets, or that time you tripped at your academy graduation ceremony. The local geometry has a tendency to manifest memory as topography. It's very Freudian and very dangerous. Carter looked at Lyra. Stay close. Lyra was already standing, her eyes fixed on the viewport. Her bioluminescence was going haywire, shifting from soft blue to a rapid strobing white that made her look like a warning beacon. It's awake, she whispered. They cycled through the airlock and stepped out onto the surface. The ground wasn't dirt or rock. It was a crunching carpet of diamond dust that sparkled underfoot. The sky above was a swirling bruise of purple and black, dominated by the broken ribs of the ancient structures that towered kilometers into the void. Carter took his third step, and the world tilted. Suddenly, he wasn't on an alien moon anymore. He was back in his childhood kitchen in Dayton, Ohio. The transition was so complete, so perfect, that for a moment he forgot he'd ever left. The smell of burnt toast and summer rain filled his nose. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the drip of the faucet that his father had always meant to fix but never had. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen table, white ceramic with a chipped rim. Emma was there. She was standing by the window in her flight suit, looking young and alive and impossibly real. Sunlight streamed through the glass, catching in her dark hair. Carter, she said, turning to him with that crooked smile he'd spent 10 years trying to forget. You're going to be late. Carter's heart stopped. Then it started again, hammering against his ribs like it was trying to break free. Emma, he choked out. It's just a treaty, little brother, she said, walking toward him. It won't last. War is what we do. It's what we've always done. Carter reached out with a trembling hand. This wasn't a hologram. It felt real. The warmth of the kitchen, the weight of gravity. He could hear his own breathing, sharp and quick. Carter! The voice was sharp, cutting through the warm kitchen air like a blade through paper. A hand gripped his shoulder hard enough to bruise. The kitchen dissolved into mist. The smell of toast vanished, replaced by the sterile, freezing scent of the alien moon. Carter was on his knees on the diamond dust, and Lyra was crouched in front of him, her hands gripping his arms with desperate strength. Her eyes were wide, burning with intensity. It's a defense mechanism. The ruins project your own neural pathways onto the environment. If you get lost in the echo, you never leave. Do you understand me? You never leave. Carter gasped, sucking in cold air that tasted like metal. I saw her. I saw Emma. It was her. It was not her, Lyra said, pulling him to his feet. It was your grief. You have to ground yourself. Focus on the cold. Focus on the pain in your knee where you fell. Focus on me. Carter looked at her. Her face was the only solid thing in a world that was trying to dissolve around him. He nodded slowly, forcing his pulse to calm. I'm good. You're lying, Lyra said, but we don't have time for truth. Let's move. They pushed forward toward the largest spire, a cathedral of glass and impossible angles that seemed to anchor the reality of this broken moon. As they approached, Carter saw the entrance. Massive obsidian doors, 10 stories high, with no visible controls or hinges. We need explosives, Carter muttered, scanning for some kind of access panel. Save your munitions, Lyra said. She walked up to the obsidian slab. She didn't push. She didn't search for a hidden mechanism. She simply laid her palm flat against the cold stone. The reaction was instantaneous. The bioluminescent patterns on Lyra's skin flared brilliant white, so bright that Carter had to shield his eyes. The obsidian surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Veins of matching white light shot through the massive doors, spreading in complex fractal patterns that mirrored the markings on Lyra's arms exactly. The ground shook. The sound was like a choir of deep bells, resonating in Carter's chest. The doors split down the middle and slid open with the groan of something that hadn't moved in a million years. Carter stared. That's not standard Zavine biology. I've read the files. You don't interface with rocks. Lyra didn't look back. She walked into the dark corridor beyond, her glowing skin providing the only light. There's a lot you don't know, Carter. He caught up to her in 3 strides and grabbed her arm, spinning her around to face him. Who are you really? Envoys don't open million-year-old alien vaults with a touch. Lyra looked at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up at his eyes. She didn't pull away. I told you in the cell, I'm the 3rd daughter of House Mithril. The files say I'm a distant cousin, a minor noble with a talent for languages. That's the lie my government tells. She paused. The truth is that I'm a direct heir, and that's exactly why I'm here. Because sometimes in my family, a child is born with the old blood, the genetic resonance, the biological key that connects us to the progenitors who built these machines. Carter's grip loosened. The high command fears you. They fear that if the people knew I could talk to the gods, they would listen to me instead of the generals. Lyra's voice was bitter. So they made me an envoy, a glorified exile, kept useful but kept far away from the throne. Carter looked at her with new understanding. So this whole time you've been just as trapped as I have. Lyra laughed, a short, sharp sound. We're all trapped, Carter, some by treaties, some by blood. They moved deeper into the ruin. The corridor opened into a central chamber, a rotunda of dizzying scale. In the center, a beam of coherent light shot straight up from the floor to a crystalline lens in the ceiling, hundreds of meters above. Surrounding the beam were floating panels of hard light, holographic records suspended in the air like frozen ghosts. Echoes, Lyra said, moving toward them. Historical recordings. She waved her hand through the holographic interface and the images sharpened. They weren't just pictures. They were 3-dimensional scenes, moments captured in time and preserved for eternity. Carter watched in growing horror as a recording from 10 years ago materialized in front of them. It showed a human fleet admiral in dress uniform shaking hands with a Zavine general in ceremonial armor. They weren't fighting, they were exchanging data pads like business partners closing a deal. The audio crackled to life. Casualties are within acceptable projections, the human admiral said, his voice calm and businesslike. The fear index is running high on both sides. Funding for the new fleet build-out is secured. The Senate won't question defense spending for another decade. Agreed, the Zavine general replied, their translated voice equally cold. The purity factions are fully mobilized. My poets are writing songs about human atrocities. Peace would be inconvenient right now. Unprofitable. Carter felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the timestamp in the corner of the recording. 3 days before the Battle of Kestrel's Reach. 3 days before Emma died. It was staged, he whispered. The whole war. It wasn't a misunderstanding or an escalation. It was a joint operation. They manufactured it. Lyra was watching a different screen, her face stricken with horror and rage. It showed another recording. This one of the original draft of the Riven Protocol being written. The section banning the bond kiss was highlighted. A voice spoke over the footage, a voice that sounded disturbingly like Lyra's father. Insert Protocol 19. We must sever the empathy connection. If humans and Zavine are allowed to bond, they will see through our narrative. They will feel each other's pain and realize we are lying to them. Keep them afraid. Keep them separate. Keep them profitable. Lyra's hands were shaking. They curated history. They killed millions of our people, millions of yours, just to keep their power structures intact. They turned empathy into a crime because empathy was the one thing that could expose them. We have to broadcast this, Carter said, looking around the chamber. Where's the transmitter? Lyra pointed to a console at the base of the light beam. There. They moved towards it together, but before they could reach the console, a red laser dot appeared on Carter's chest. Drop the weapon, a voice roared from the shadows above. Carter didn't drop, he dove. A plasma bolt scorched the air where his head had been a second earlier. He rolled behind a pillar of crystal as the chamber erupted in gunfire. From the upper balconies, figures in black tactical armor rappelled down on cables, 6 of them moving with military precision. Cinder-pack mercenaries by the look of their gear. "They have a map," Lyra shouted, ducking as a kinetic slug shattered a holographic projector next to her. Someone gave them the layout of this place. Carter popped out from behind his cover and fired 2 shots. The stun pulse wasn't designed for this kind of combat, but it worked. One mercenary went down, his armor locking up from the electrical discharge. But there were too many of them. "Suppressing fire," the lead mercenary shouted. "Flank the Zavine." Carter saw them moving to corner Lyra. She was pinned behind a low wall, weaponless, and they were closing in with the cold efficiency of professionals who'd done this 1,000 times before. "Lyra, catch!" Carter tossed his spare energy cell across the floor. It slid toward the mercenaries, spinning on the smooth stone. He aimed his pistol at the cell and pulled the trigger. The cell exploded in a blinding flash of ionized gas and electromagnetic pulse. The mercenaries' targeting systems went haywire, their visors filled with static, and Lyra moved. It was terrifyingly beautiful to watch. She didn't run. She flowed. She vaulted over the wall with inhuman grace, her body moving faster than Carter would have thought possible. She grabbed the nearest mercenary by the helmet, using her momentum to swing around behind him. She used his body as a shield against his own squad mates, then kicked the back of his knee hard enough to shatter the joint even through the armor. He went down screaming. She snatched the rifle from his hands as he fell. She spun, firing 3 precise shots. 2 more mercenaries dropped. Carter broke from his cover, sprinting toward her position. He tackled a cinder-packed operative who was lining up a shot on Lyra's back. They hit the ground hard. Carter used his elbow, driving it into the man's visor repeatedly until the glass cracked and the man went limp. They stood back to back in the center of the chamber, breathing hard. The air smelled like ozone and burnt plastic. 2 left, Carter panted. "Up top," Lyra said, pointing. "Sniper, balcony, and throw me," she added. "What?" "Throw me." Carter didn't have time to argue. He cupped his hands. Lyra stepped into them and he heaved upward with all his strength. The moon's lower gravity helped. She launched into the air like a missile. She landed on the balcony railing with perfect balance, paused for a split second, then leaped onto the sniper. They tumbled back into the shadows. There was a struggle, a wet thud, and then silence. Lyra reappeared at the railing holding the sniper's rifle. "Clear," she called down. Carter slumped against the console, his chest heaving. "Remind me never to make you angry." "We're not done," Lyra said, dropping down from the balcony with cat-like grace. She landed beside him and looked at the console. "The transmission system, we need to activate it." Carter examined the interface. It was a smooth metallic surface with 2 indentations shaped like hands. But they weren't just hand scanners. They were lined with neural needles, thin probes designed to interface directly with nerve endings. "It requires dual input," Carter said. "One human, one Zavine." He placed his hand over one of the slots experimentally. The machine hummed. A blue light turned amber. Genetic match confirmed, human, neural synchronization waiting. Lyra placed her hand over the other slot. The machine's hum changed pitch. Genetic match confirmed, Zavine, warning resonance required for transmission protocol. "Resonance?" Carter asked, though he already knew the answer. Lyra stared at the screen, reading the alien script that was appearing in the air. "It's not just a transmitter, Carter. It's a truth engine. It validates the data by reading the intent of the users. It needs to know we're not lying. It needs a shared neural state to verify authenticity." She looked at him, her eyes dark and terrified. "It needs a bond." Carter's world seemed to stop. "You mean—" "Yes," Lyra whispered. "The console requires a resonance bond kiss. Not for pleasure, for proof." The silence between them was heavier than the ancient stones around them. Carter looked at the machine, then back at Lyra. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "If we do this," he said, his voice steady but low, "there's no going back. The moment we link, the network will register the biosignature across the entire galaxy. Every monitor from Earth to Zava will know what we did. We'll be branded, not just as traitors, but as biological deviants. They'll say I brainwashed you. They'll say you compromised me. I'll never hold a rank again. I might never walk free again. Lyra stepped closer. Her scent filled his senses. Ozone and cedar, storm and earth. We can walk away, she said quietly. We can take the skiff and run to the outer rim. Disappear into the colonies where nobody asks questions. Let the war happen. Let them kill each other. Is that what you want? Carter asked. Lyra looked at the holographic recordings still playing around them. The admirals and generals making their deals. The bodies stacking up in the name of profit and control. No, she said fiercely. I want to burn their lies down. Carter looked at her lips. He looked at the curve of her jaw. He looked at the pulse of light beneath her skin that marked her heartbeat. For 10 years he had been told that this woman, this being, was poison, that her touch was a weapon, that wanting her was a defect in his programming. But standing here in the ruins of a world destroyed by the same fear that had built the treaty, he realized something. The only defect was obedience. He stepped forward. Lyra looked up at him. Her breath hitched. She looked scared. Not of the war or the consequences or the galaxy that would hunt them. She looked scared of this, of him, of what might happen if they crossed this line. You want peace? Carter said, his voice rough with emotion. Then stop pretending you are made of rules. He reached out and cupped her face. Her skin was warm and vibrant under his palms. He could feel the hum of her bioenergy against his hands, a living current. Lyra's eyes searched his face. Kiss me, she whispered, and break the protocol. Carter didn't hesitate this time. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't like a human kiss. The moment they connected, there was a blinding flash of white light behind his eyes. And then the walls of his mind collapsed. He wasn't Carter anymore. He was Lyra. He felt the crushing weight of silence in a palace full of people who never truly spoke to each other. He felt the coldness of a father who looked at him and saw only a political liability, a threat to be managed. He felt the intense, burning loneliness of being surrounded by billions of people and being unable to touch a single one without diplomatic gloves and legal waivers. And she was him. She felt the grief that lived in his chest like a stone that would never dissolve. She felt Emma's ship disintegrating in a flash of light. She felt the rigid, suffocating discipline he used every single day to keep himself from falling apart. She felt the exact moment he had seen her in the docking bay and the terrifying spark of want that he had immediately tried to strangle. It was overwhelming. It was a flood of raw, unfiltered truth. There were no lies here, no diplomacy, no carefully constructed personas. Just two souls, naked and shivering in the dark, finding each other. It was the most terrifying thing Carter had ever felt, and it was the most beautiful. Neural resonance confirmed, a voice boomed through the chamber and simultaneously inside their heads. Truth validation complete, broadcasting. The console flared with blinding light. The beam in the center of the room shot upward with renewed intensity, punching through the crystalline ceiling and out into the void of space. The broadcast began. Across the galaxy, screens flickered. In the diplomatic council rooms of Aurora Station, on the bridge of the human flagship Indomitable, in the Grand Plaza of the Zavine capital city of Java Bomb, the feed hijacked every channel. The holographic recordings played, the audio of the conspiracy broadcast on every frequency. The truth, raw and undeniable, flowing out into the universe. Carter and Lyra broke the kiss, gasping for air. They were still holding each other, foreheads touching. Carter could feel Lyra's heart beating as if it were his own. He could feel her relief washing through him like a wave, and her sudden sharp fear. It's working, she breathed. They can see it. The console hummed, processing the massive data upload. The progress indicator climbed, 40%, 50%, and then the light turned red. Override signal detected, external block initiated. The upload bar froze, the holographic evidence flickered and died, replaced by a static logo that made Lyra let out a sound that was half sob, half growl. It was a crest, a stylized serpent eating a star, the royal cipher of House Mithril. No, Lyra whispered. What is that? Carter demanded. It's not just the royal family seal, Lyra said, her face going pale. It's my brother's personal cipher. Damien. The screen flashed new text. Treaty violation detected. Biological contamination confirmed. Targets identified. Thane, Lyra, Brennan, Carter. Carter understood with horrible clarity. They didn't just stop the broadcast. They hijacked the signal. They used the resonance spike from our bond to pinpoint our exact location. We just gave them the propaganda they needed, Lyra said, her voice hollow. The chamber began to shake. The beam of light turned unstable, thrashing against the walls like a trapped animal made of pure energy. Self-destruct sequence initiated, containment failure in T-minus 60 seconds. They trapped the console, Carter shouted. It's a kill switch, Lyra grabbed his hand. Run! They sprinted back through the corridor as the ancient structure began to tear itself apart. The statues lining the walls were falling, shattering into million-year-old dust. The floor heaved beneath their feet, opening fissures that swallowed the light. They burst through the obsidian doors just as the spire behind them imploded. The shockwave threw them forward. They tumbled across the diamond sands, scrambling on hands and knees toward the skiff. The sky above was tearing open. A spatial storm triggered by the massive energy release was swirling into a vortex that bent light and warped space. To the ship! Lyra screamed. They scrambled up the ramp. Carter threw himself into the pilot's seat and slammed the thrusters to maximum. Hold on! The skiff lifted off, fighting against the gravity of the collapsing moon. Debris rained down around them. Shards of crystal, the size of buildings, spinning into the void. Carter punched the jump drive. Nothing happened. Interference, he yelled. The spatial distortion is too high. I can't get a stable field. I can stabilize it, Lyra shouted. She reached across the console. Her hands were glowing, pulsing with white-hot bioenergy. She didn't use the keyboard or the manual controls. She plunged her hands directly into the holographic core of the ship's navigation computer. Her light bled into the ship's systems like liquid electricity. The engine note changed from a scream to a roar. Now, Carter! He hit the drive. The stars elongated into streaks. The relic moon vanished in a flash of white light. They were in warp, safe, silent. Carter let go of the controls. His hands were shaking violently. He looked over at Lyra. She was slumped in her seat, her bioluminescence dim and flickering like a candle about to go out. She looked exhausted, hollowed out. But she turned to look at him, and in that look, Carter felt it. The echo, the lingering thread of the bond they had just forged. He could still feel a ghost of her emotion, her fear for what her brother had become, her shame at how the broadcast had been used. But mostly he felt the terrifying electric aftershock of the kiss. We failed, she whispered. The broadcast didn't finish. And now they have proof we broke the law. Carter unbuckled his harness. He reached across the narrow space and took her hand. It was trembling. We didn't fail, he said. We know the truth now. We know who the real enemy is. He squeezed her hand, feeling her pulse against his palm. And we know we're not alone. Lyra looked at their joined hands. She didn't pull away. She squeezed back. No, she said, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engines. We're definitely not alone. She paused. But Carter, I can still feel you. In my head, in my chest. It's like you're... I know, Carter said, looking into her dark eyes. I can feel you too. The bond hadn't broken when they'd stopped kissing. The resonance was still there, a warm background hum beneath everything else. A connection that couldn't be severed by distance or will. The skiff hurtled through the dark, carrying two fugitives who had just broken the oldest law in the galaxy, who were now inextricably, biologically bound to finish what they had started. The galaxy wasn't big enough to hide them. The fleets were mobilizing. The war machine was waking up. But for the first time since Emma had died, Carter felt something other than grief and duty. He felt hope. And in the warm pressure of Lyra's hand in his, in the echo of her heartbeat that he could feel as clearly as his own, he felt something even more dangerous. He felt love. The screen in front of them flickered, showing their faces side by side under a single word that was being broadcast across every human and Zavine channel. Traitors. Carter looked at it. Then he looked at Lyra. So, he said, where do we go from here? Lyra's bioluminescence pulsed once, stronger now. A soft, defiant blue. We finish this, she said. We make them listen. Carter thought about Emma, about the treaty that had been built on her death, about the lie that had cost millions of lives. He thought about the bond he could still feel. humming between him and the woman sitting next to him. The connection that terrified the people in power because it made hatred impossible. And he made his choice. Then let's go, he said. The stars stretched into infinity ahead of them. And somewhere in that vast dark, a future waited. One they would build together or die trying. The skiff's engines burned bright as they jumped toward their fate, toward the truth, toward each other. And the galaxy would never be the same.